Peace, 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 family. Time to get back to a reading. So we're gonna do chapter 9 while I got some time, and see what information chapter 9 brings to the foreground. I know it's late for everybody, so that's kind of cool. Y'all can hear it when y'all get a chance. So this chapter is called Union. This is a history of Ireland by Peter and Fiona Somerset Fry. A lot of things have been revealed. If you didn't catch anything, go back and catch the other ones. If you didn't get the book because this history of Ireland coincides with the history over here. So much so that I think that the government is for them Irish folks. I think that's who they were recognizing, unless they were other people. Anyway, we ain't gonna go into too much detail there, but let's read this. Looks like we're starting in 1782 to 1800. Uh, to 1800. Okay, got you, got you. All right, let's get some reading done. Between 1782 and 1800, the period of what became known as Grattan's Parliament, Ireland enjoyed an unprecedented prosperity. Although the native Irish people had suffered appalling injustices and deprivations, the country had been stable without war or rebellion for the longest period in history since the Viking invasion. As a result of the population, as a result, the population had risen from less than 2 million in 1700 to 4 million, and it was going on rising. It was to go on rising. A land which had been hampered by its emptiness now had people to exploit its resources. Trading restrictions were lifted. Catholic businessmen were at last able to invest at home instead of sending their money to France or Spain, and the Irish economy was ready to boom. In 1706, Ireland's total export had been worth £50,000. By 1783, they had risen to almost £3 million, and by 1796, they were over 5 million. Linen exports had increased from a mere half million yards in 1706 to 16 million yards in 1783, and then almost tripled to 47 million yards in 1796. The woolen industry never did well in export markets but benefited from an expanding home market, and a cotton industry begun in 1770s was so well supported by Parliament with bounties and a protective tariff that by the 1790s its exports rivaled those of linen. Irish glass revived so rapidly in the 1780s that it supplied almost the whole of the home market, and an increase in Irish brewing led to a decline in an import of beer from England. There was greater prosperity on the farms too. The harvests were bad from 1782 to 1784, but Parliament regulated the situation with a system of state bounties, similar to the modern agricultural subsidies, which encouraged export to foreign markets except in times of shortage at home. For the first time, Ireland had begun a great corn growing country. I'm sorry. For the first time, Ireland became a great corn growing country. Rents went up, but so did profits, and there was far more work for laborers. It was a common sight to see bands of men from the West tramping along the country roads to work in the harvest of the Midlands and the East. The provisions trade flourished, and cattle exports went up. The Anglo-Irish improved their houses and built new ones. Industrialists dug a network of canals, and Dublin, although embellished with wide streets and fine squares, acquired a stately custom house, the Royal Irish Academy, and the strikingly domed Four Courts. It became one of the most elegant capital cities in Europe. But Grattan's Parliament, independent of Britain though it was, did not truly represent the people of Ireland. It consisted of a handful of rich Protestants floating a raft for the Protestant nation amidst a sea of disenfranchised Catholics and Presbyterians. It was an irresponsible parliament without control of the executive which carried out its decisions. Sometimes it was little more than a brilliantly oratorical debating chamber. At times, it was merely an opposition to His Majesty's government. For the king, on the advice of the British ministers, could veto any Irish legislation, and the executive in Ireland was still headed by the Lord Lieutenant, always an Englishman and responsible to the British Home Secretary. The Lord Lieutenant still appointed and dismissed Irish government ministers, and his chief secretary went on managing Parliament in an old, corrupt way, bribing powerful men with titles, pensions, and places. Large numbers of peonage were created, and the expenditure on pensions rose annually. Ireland was still being run in the interest of England. The Patriots called for reform. In 1783, in 1783, Flood, which is a person, okay, Flood, um, even went so far as to appear in the Commons in volunteer uniform, hot foot from a volunteer convention, with a plan for reform in his pocket. But the heyday of the volunteers was over. They had been formed to threaten the British government, not a free Irish parliament, and Flood's bill was thrown out. But neither he, Charlemont, nor other leading patriots were prepared to strengthen the hand of Parliament against the government by giving political power to Catholics. They would not forget that earlier Patriot Parliament, wait, wait, they could not forget that earlier Patriot Parliament of the James II reign, when Catholics had made ready to reclaim their ancient estates. Catholics were dangerous. Only Grattan was wiser. He knew his parliament most or must broaden its power base. Quote, I should be ashamed of giving freedom to but 600,000 of my fellow countrymen, he said, when I could extend it to 2 million more. I should be ashamed of giving freedom to but 600,000 of my fellow countrymen when I could extend it to 2 million more. Sadly, the Patriots were not persuaded. Interesting how they're talking about, no, that's 600,000, not 6 million. Okay, my bad. Then in 1789, the French Revolution toppled the monarchy and the feudal aristocracy of France. For almost the first time in history, it was power to the people, and the people proclaimed as a major principle of their revolution that every kind of religious discrimination should be abolished. The French tithe system was swept away and church property confiscated. Ireland's Catholic Ireland's Catholics were shocked by this treatment of the Catholic Church in France, but the Presbyterians, who had always had leanings toward republicanism, took up the French ideas avidly. In 1790, when one of the few remaining corps of volunteers met in Belfast, resolutions were passed advocating the abolition of tithes, at least those paid by Catholics and Presbyterians to conformist Protestant clergy, and urging Presbyterians to support the enfranchisement of Catholics and parliamentary reform. Then, in 1791, the theme was taken a stage further. A pamphlet appeared entitled An Argument on Behalf of the Catholics of Ireland, which attacked the parliamentary constitution of 1782 and advocated a union of Catholics and Presbyterians to force political reform. Give me one quick second. All right. The author was Theobald Wolfe Tone, Tone, a young Protestant lawyer descended from one of Cromwell's soldiers, whose father, a Dublin coach builder, had given him a good education at Trinity College and then at the Inns of Court in London. But Wolfe Tone had found the law tedious in comparison with politics. In his first pamphlet of note, written when Britain was about to declare war on Spain, he declared an independent Ireland need not join in the war and was delighted when, hanging around the Dublin bookshops on the day of publication, he heard bishops express their fury. He was prepared to go much further than Grattan in the cause of Irish freedom. He acknowledged no loyalty to the king, who never visited Ireland anyway, and believed, though prudence sometimes prevented him from saying so, that Ireland should separate herself entirely from Britain. Tone knew he could count on Catholic support for the argument because he was well known to members of the Catholic Committee, a hitherto genteel and inoffensive body which had recently shed some of its standier, stadier elements. Gotta look that word up. He was less sure of his support among Presbyterians and gratified when he received an immediate invitation to Belfast. The major towns of Ulster contained many political clubs, formed when the local Irish volunteer detachment had broken up. Middle-class Protestants, including Presbyterians, had found the volunteers gave them a chance of political expression, and the political clubs performed a similar function, bringing patriots together so they could exchange ideas and form pressure groups to lobby members of parliament. In Belfast, these clubs were already being taken over by a secret committee headed by a Presbyterian woolen draper um, with very radical leanings named Samuel Nielsen. Nielsen and his secret committee entertained Tone to dinner, and round the table they hammered out the basis of a new reforming organization which would adopt as its first principle the union of Catholics, Protestants, and Presbyterians. It was to be known as the Society of United Irishmen. To most people, Wolfe Tone's idea of a patriotic union between members of different branches of the Christian faith seems entirely reasonable. Their common love of Christ ought to be stronger than differences of form and doctrine. Tone soon found, however, that the reality was otherwise. Some 90% of Belfast Presbyterians were decidedly anti-Catholic. They still retained the old Protestant fear that one day Catholics would take back all that had been wrested from them. In the countryside, this fear had some substance. Over much of Ireland, there was a hunger for land. With the rise in population, farms had become even smaller as they were divided and subdivided among the members of a family. In Ulster, however, so many Presbyterian farmers had immigrated to America that there was land to spare. Catholics from the South and West flooded in to take it, and in their desperation outbid the local Presbyterians in a matter of rent, just as they had done over a century earlier. Presbyterian peasant farmers joined societies such as the Hearts of Oak and forced landlords to agree to fixed rents. Through solidarity and a show of force, they put landlords where they wanted them. They were not going to allow Catholic newcomers to queer their pitch. About 1785, a new Presbyterian peasant organization, the Peep O'Day Boys, had begun attacking Catholics who outbid Presbyterians in rent. At dawn, the Peep O'Day, they would appear at Catholic homesteads and either burn the house down or terrorize the occupants by threats, physical abuse, and firing through their windows. When they had no specific target, the People Day Boys would congregate in country towns and villages, hold military-style parades with colors flying, with colors flying. Where is it at? Colors flying. Bands playing and shots being fired, and then smashed the window of Catholic houses and churches, beat up any Catholics unfortunate enough to be around, and create a general atmosphere of aggression and terror, designed to drive Catholics away from the area. Naturally, the Catholics formed a revival or a rival society, appropriately called the Defenders, and held similar military style parades. It was the beginning of a bitter sectarian warfare that in Ulster was never ceased. From the start, the People Day Boys controlled Armagh. They, in 1791 and 1792, I'm sorry, then in 1791 and 1792, there was a great deal of fighting in the surrounding counties of Tyrone, Down, Louth, Meath, Cavan, and Monaghan. Large bodies of men, mostly armed with pikes and staves, scythes and pitchforks, but sometimes also with firearms, fought pitched battles in broad daylight. The Protestant lords, who were for the most part the magistrates, tried to maintain order in the local militia and occasionally regular troops, but large areas. Wait, tried to maintain order with the local militia and occasionally regular troops, but large areas were in control of one society or other for months at a time. The defenders spread into parts of the country which were entirely Catholic, where there was no threat from members of any other religion, and took over the role of the White Boys as a secret militant organization dedicated to the redress of grievances, such as the payment of tithes and excessive rents. In the North, there was still mainly a sectarian movement concerned with protecting Catholics. The People Day Boys had become seriously alarmed when, in 1793, Catholics were given the franchise on the same terms as Protestants, and sectarian feuding had increased in ferocity. Then, in September 1795, a large party of defenders, acting on the principle that the best method of defense is sometimes attack, went for a smaller group of People Day Boys on a patch of ground near the city of Armagh known as the Diamond. In spite of their inferior numbers, the People Day Boys beat their attackers off, and the bodies of 20 to 30 defenders were left dead in the field. That same evening, jubilant in their victory, the People Day Boys reformed themselves into the Orange Society, the color orange being a symbol of the victory of William of Orange over James II more than a century earlier. The Orange Men, ain't that what y'all call Trump? Never mind. The Orange Men attacked Ulster Catholics with merciless brutality. They assaulted them, turned them out of their homes, or papered them, pinning notices to their doors telling them to go to hell or Connaught. That is, to go to Connaught or die. Poor Catholic weavers had their looms broken. The laborers' houses were burned down. Sometimes as many as a dozen houses would be burned in one place at night. At the end of 1795, the governor of Armagh wrote, quote, "No night passes that houses are not destroyed, and scarce a week that some dreadful murders are not committed. Nothing can exceed the animosity between Protestant and Catholics at this moment in this country," end quote. You know, that kind of reminds me of Passover. Put something on your door. What they put? What they put on their door? I'm just saying. Okay. Against such a background, it is not surprising that the Ulster Irishmen could not at first make much headway. Then the ideas of the French Revolution gradually pulled the different religions together. The Protestant ascendancy was, on the whole, in favor of the ancient regime. Its members were, to use the terms of the Revolution, aristocrats. But the young men of the new middle class, whether Protestant, Presbyterian, or Catholic, were looking for a political alignment that was fresh, idealistic, nationalist, untainted with the corruption of endemic with the corruption endemic in high places, and far more radical than any group in Grattan's parliament. Their sympathy went to the Democrats, the revolutionaries who had declared the Republic. If Ireland became a republic, the last link with Britain would be gone. For some time, William Pitt, the British Prime Minister, had been worried about the belligerence of revolutionary France, which had declared war on Austria and then Prussia in 1792. Pitt certainly did not want Catholic Ireland, which until recently had had so many military, commercial, and religious ties with France, to catch the fever of revolution and perhaps provide a backdoor for the invasion of Britain. The castle, that powerful group which surrounded the Lord Lieutenant, was frightened into a reactionary and repressive stance, and a Catholic relief bill put before Parliament in 1792 was largely, though not entirely, withdrawn. Pitt was bolder. He had relieved British Catholics of their penal restrictions in 1791, and he was convinced that Irish Catholics should be conciliated. The Catholic Church looked with horror on the new French Republic, and most members of the Irish Brigade, which had served the French monarchy, were transferring their loyalty to George III. If Catholics were given relief, they would be less likely to ally themselves with Wolfe Tone and other Protestant radicals. In 1793, when war broke out between Britain and France, another Catholic Relief Act was passed with the support of two-thirds of Parliament dominated by patriots. It enabled Catholics to bear arms, vote, sit on juries, take degrees at Trinity College, Dublin, and hold commissions in the army below the rank of general. But Catholics still could not hold government office or sit in Parliament. Quote, if the Catholics deserved what has been granted, Tone committed wirely, they deserved what has been withheld. Wait, they deserve what has been withheld. If they did not deserve what has been withheld, what has been granted should have been refused. End quote. But the House of Commons, less logical than Tone, rejected a motion admiring Catholics to Parliament. I'm sorry, but the House of Commons, less logical than Tone, rejected a motion admitting Catholics to Parliament by 163 votes to 69. Grattan, consistent and high minded, was deeply regretful that Catholics were not to take their seats in Parliament. The Catholics themselves joyfully dissolved their own lobbying body, the Catholic Committee, as if all their dreams had come true, and gratefully presented Wolfe Tone, who had been their secretary, with £1,500 and a gold medal. But Grattan immediately began preparing a new Catholic relief bill of his own to enable the Catholic upper classes to stand for Parliament. It is a measure of the extent to which his prestige had fallen since 1782, and how far Tone and the radicals had advanced, that when the bill was introduced in 1795, it was heavily defeated. Pitt and the British government would not support it because of their fear of Tone and the United Irishmen. And Grattan's so-called independent parliament still could not pass any measure Britain did not want. The government compensated Catholics for their disappointment by the foundation. Hold on a second. Damn, I should turn on another light. Give me a second, y'all. Let's go second lights. Hold on one second. Hey, if you want me to close this door, if this is bothering you. Can you hear me? You can't hear me? Okay. Hmm. Okay, I'm reading. All right, give me a minute, y'all. I'm trying to make sure I can see the doggone pages. All right. Hopefully this battery will last here. Okay. The government, we're on page 196. The government compensated Catholics for their disappointment by the foundation of a college at Maynooth, where the Earls of Kildare had their seat, for the training of Catholic priests. For more than 2 centuries, priests had been trained in seminaries in France, but since the Revolution, the Catholic bishops had been far less inclined to send novita- uh, novitiates to that godless country. And the last thing Pitt wanted was a Catholic priesthood indoctrinated with revolutionary ideas. Give me a second, I gotta clear my throat, y'all. The French were very interested, not to say intrigued, by the United Irish, and in 1793 they sent a secret agent into Ireland, an Anglican clergyman of Irish descent called William Jackson. Jackson, however, was ill chosen, having no undercover skills whatever, and before long his mission was turned into farce. He found himself occupied everywhere by an old friend from London, a solicitor called uh, Cocaine, CockaYne. But Cocaine was not visiting Dublin's clubs and taverns like Jackson merely for old time's sake. He had been planted by the British as a counter agent. Cocaine, though, damn, cocaine, cocaine, sorry, turned out to be no more competent than Jackson. When Jackson was arrested and brought to trial a year later in 1784, Cocaine's evidence was pathetically inadequate. He had partly overheard treasonable conversations and partly understood them, yet he remembered enough to compromise Wolfe Tone and others very seriously before the trial came to a whatever that word is. I'm gonna leave it alone. Conclusion. Okay. Jackson dying in the dock from a Jackson dying in the dock from a self-administered poison. Okay. It came out during the trial that Tone had told Jackson, knowing he was a French emissary, that an invasion from France would be welcomed in Ireland. Such a statement made in wartime was clearly treasonable. Nevertheless, Tone managed to make a bargain with the government whereby he could avoid prosecution by exiling himself to America. And when Jackson's trial ended, he went to Belfast to take a ship for Philadelphia. When he was in Belfast, he was in touch with Nielsen. The United Irishman had been proscribed when Jackson was arrested, but Nielsen told him that a new secret organization of United Irishmen was being set up throughout the country with the distinct and county committees, an elaborate elected hierarchy, and a secret leadership. Nielsen asked Tone to tell the French minister in Philadelphia that a new underground organization intended to combine with the defenders in the cause of revolution. During the last 2 years, the crude, loosely organized but massive defender movement has spread through the whole of Ireland, animated not so much by the sectarian feeling as the poverty that went with being Catholic. If the rich would alleviate the sufferings of the poor, the government was told more than once they would hear no more of risings or defenders. But the rich were greedy and the government short-sighted, and everywhere the defenders rounded up the peasantry, administered unlawful oaths, and intimidated those who resisted, burning burning the turf they needed as fuel and rooting up the potatoes they fed on. In some districts, the defenders fixed the rent a courtier should pay and the laborer should get, and threatened with death any peasant who accepted worse terms. There were no police in the countryside, no effective authority, and bands of several hundreds, even thousands of defenders raided the houses of the gentry of arms, horses, and saddlery. When some landlords fought them using local militia, as many as 100 defenders might be left dead on the field and even larger numbers captured. Yet there were always thousands more. And among them, French revolutionary sentiments were taking root. Defenders were swearing to dethrone all kings and plant the tree of liberty on our Irish land, to be loyal to the brother defenders and the French, and to pull down the British laws. They were ripe for the picking, but the better they were ripe for the picking by the better educated, more experienced, and mostly middle class United Irishmen. When Wolfe Tone arrived in Philadelphia, he put a plan for France's intervention in Ireland to the French minister there. He was depressed by what he felt was a lukewarm reception and even made plans to forget all about Ireland and her troubles until he received a letter describing the progress being made by the reorganized United Irishmen. On the 1st of January 1796, he sailed for France. The French minister in Philadelphia had given him a letter of introduction, and armed with that, besides a great deal of charm, ability, and perseverance, my bad, he contrived to reach members of the Directory, which ruled the country, and persuade them that an invasion of Ireland could be successful. French troops would be met by Irish revolutionaries, he told them with irresistible optimism. The British driven out and the Republic set up. Britain was the only country in Europe which had not fallen to French arms, and if France could take over a friendly Ireland, the French persuaded themselves, the conquest of Britain would surely follow. In the summer, the brilliant young George Hoche, Hoche, whose reputation rivaled that of Bonaparte, was put at the head of an expedition to Ireland. Hoche and Tone, who had French military rank himself by now, went to Brest to assemble an invasion force. On the 16th of December, in delicious weather with the sun as warm and bright as May, to use Tone's word, all was ready. Nearly 14,000 French troops, as gay as if they were going to a ball, to quote Tone once more, embarked in 13 ships and during the night set sail. Mm. But the French had sacked their experienced naval officers during the Revolution, and the seamanship of their replacements was not up to sailing men of war in winter gales. One ship foundered on a rock outside Brest, Brest. The next day, a violent storm blew up. Another ship was lost, and the flagship carrying Hoche was separated from the rest of the fleet. It was 3 weeks before it turned up again in a French port. The storm was followed by fog, and more ships were dispersed. But on December 21st, all but 8 or 9 ships had reassembled and were sailing slowly and majestically into the broad waters sheltered by towering mountains on either side of Bantry Bay. Sailing too slowly, the wind was against them. They made almost no headway, and in the evening they cast their anchor only just inside the bay. Let me check my phone. Okay. Um, During the night, a strong wind got up and 20 ships were blown into the Atlantic. The previous evening, a messenger had galloped for all he was worth over snow-covered roads from Bantry to Cork, carrying the dread news to the government. But the gale prevented the French ships from landing their troops ahead land or sailing further into the bay. On Christmas Day, the weather was even worse. The French were still nowhere near the landing, and their admiral ordered them to make for the safety of the open sea. Some ships weighed anchor immediately and followed him back to Brest. Others delayed because of the fog. A few were still in the bay on the 31st of December. When one of them sent out boats, the local contingent of the Galway militia, some 400 men, bravely lined up on the beach. But the Frenchmen soon returned to their ships, and 3 days later, the whole of the French fleet had left for home. Tone, who was with the ships in Bantry, commented in his diary that England had had her greatest escape since the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The government was badly frightened by the news from Bantry. Had the French invaded, they would have met no more than 8,000 troops, many of them militia, on their way to Cork. The Catholics, the government supposed, would rise. It would have been impossible to hold a rebellious Ireland against a sizable force from a nation which, at that time, had won military glory all over Europe. But the Catholics did not rise. For 10 days, the French fleet lay in Irish waters, and the Munster peasantry remained loyal. Quote, their goodwill, zeal, and activity exceeded all description, end quote, the commanding British general wrote to George III. Catholics were traditionally monarchists. Their church leaders upheld authority, and many Catholic peasants, ignorant and illiterate as they were, suspected the French of having been invited over by Orangemen to drive them off their holdings. The government knew the respite was only temporary. The French would try to invade again. Much earlier in the year, the castle had pushed a merciless insurrection act through Parliament, which allowed magistrates to hang anyone who administered an unlawful oath, such as the oath of the Defenders, Orangemen, and United Irishmen, and to transport for life anyone who swore such an oath. Then habeas corpus had been suspended. The French failure was felt most keenly in Ulster, where the United Irishmen were attracting those young, educated, middle-class Irishmen of all three religions who were without patrons, representation in Grattan's Parliament, and all too often the vote. Britain and the British connection had given them nothing. They could not be grateful, and neither could they be loyal. Disloyalty was often a fashion, a sentiment, and almost an amusement, wrote W.E.H. Leakey, Lecky, a great historian of the 18th century Ireland. It had always been a British idea that Irishmen should be loyal to Britain. The patriotic attachment of the United Irishmen was to Ireland and Ireland alone, and the name of the game they would play for Ireland was sedition. In the beginning of 1797, Ulster was in a condition of anarchy. The United Irish leadership found that in the defenders it had taken on a monolith it could not control. Defenders took readily to the wearing of the green, a green ribbon or piece of clothing which betokened membership of the United Irish, and under its cover indulged in all manner of cruelties, private vendettas, lawlessness, and crime. Bands of defenders, several hundred strong, Irishmen swept the cells of United Irishmen along with them when they terrorized County Monaghan, and County Tyrone was more or less taken over by them. In the daytime, parades were held quite openly, and at night, bonfires flared on the hilltops, lighting the way for marauding parties of defenders in search of arms or simply plunder. Law was set aside and the countryside controlled and terrorized by various defender bands. In March, the government ordered General Lake, who commanded such government troops as they were in Ulster, to pacify and disarm the province. He adopted a policy of pardon for all those who surrendered their arms by a given date and extreme toughness towards those who did not. The first military raids seem to have come as a surprise to the people, and in a fortnight, more than 5,400 guns, 600 bayonets, and 350 pistols were seized in peasants' cabins. During the following week, many swore United Irishmen. Wait. During the following weeks, many sworn United Irishmen surrendered some of their arms, took an insincere oath of allegiance, and hid the rest of their arms carefully away. The regular troops were supplemented by Catholic militia and a Protestant yeomanry commanded by a local gentry. They were, all of them, totally lacking in military discipline and restraint, and when small parties were detailed to make a night search of a large number of cabins scattered over a wide area, shocking atrocities occurred. Cabins were burned down almost as a matter of routine, and their occupants cut about and sometimes killed, even when no weapons were found. Suspects were flogged and tortured by half hanging and then sent off in droves to serve in the British Army. Grattan decided to take a stand. For 3 years, he had been trying without success to persuade the government to redress the grievances of the peasants. As a final effort, he reintroduced his bill to enable the Catholic gentry to stand for Parliament. But once again, the reactionary and repressive government saw that the bill was thrown out, and Grattan, after a second failure, withdrew from the House of Commons. Wolfe Tone was soon back in France from Bantry Bay in company with General Hock. In April, the British Navy was paralyzed by mutinies at its bases in the Channel, caused largely by disaffected Irishmen pressed into its service. On the much quoted principle that England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity, Tone and Hock agreed that a small expedition to Ireland should be got together immediately. The Dutch had an army and a fleet at their port. Wait. The Dutch had an army and a fleet at their port of the Texel, Texel, waiting for employment, and it was decided that they would make the invasion as soon as possible, and Tone should sail with them. Hock would follow with the French fleet from Brest. It was July before the Dutch fleet was ready. The British difficulties were long since ever indeed. British wait. The British difficulties were long since over indeed. British ships were beginning to gather outside of Texel and hem the Dutch in. Tone fretted on the Dutch admiral's flagship, while the winds chopped and changed and the British fleet beyond the harbor built up. Then in September, General Hock, the only Frenchman entirely committed to the Irish cause, died suddenly. And in October, when the Dutch fleet at last left port, it was annihilated by the British in the Battle of Camperdown. Tone had left the Dutch fleet several weeks earlier, and in December he had an audience with Napoleon. But while Napoleon was impressed with Tone, he needed a rich enemy to defend and plunder rather than sympathizers to liberate, so that he could finance his vastly expensive armies. He doubted anyway whether the French fleet could carry troops safely to Ireland or even across the English Channel. French forces were victorious on land, but the British were supreme at sea. Nevertheless, early in 1798, Napoleon had a whirlwind tour of the Channel ports and ordered flat-bottom invasion barges. But British sea power continued formidable, and in May he embarked his troops for Egypt. Hey, peace, 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 peace. Glad you're in here. Okay. Page 202, chapter 9. Ireland had reached a state of vast cataclysmic disorder. There was no clear-cut war between Irishmen and Englishmen or Scots of the regular troops in the countries. Less than a quarter were British, but a massive disturbance involving those termed loyal Irish, that is, Irishmen and women who supported the government, and the so-called disloyal Irish, most of whom had taken the oaths of United Irishmen. In Ulster, loyal Irishmen were mostly Protestant, and Presbyterian Orangemen or Anglo-Irish gentry or their tenants. Disloyal Irishmen numbered Protestant and Presbyterian among their leaders, but were otherwise mostly terrified Catholics. In the rest of Ireland, both sides were largely Catholic. The United Irishmen were organized as a hierarchy with the National Directory named after the French directory or French directory, well, directory, drawn from four provincial committees. In March 1798, the government, tipped off by an informer, arrested the whole of the Leinster Provincial Committee, which included 16 members of the National Directory, most of which who were meeting at the house of one of their members, a Dublin woolen merchant named Oliver Bond, like James Bond that way. Okay. It was a very severe blow. The Society of United Irishmen was, in effect, decapitated. Its chief military organization was, unlike the rest of its leaders, a nobleman, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, the brother of the Duke of Leinster. He was forewarned and escaped when Bond's house was raided, only to be betrayed by a second informer a few weeks later when he was staying at a house in the house of a Dublin feather merchant. He was lying on his bed when the police entered, but rose and fought furiously, mortally wounding a officer with his dagger. He was shot himself in the shoulder and died in prison 6 weeks later. He was not particularly clever, but young, handsome, aristocratic, and brave. He had the qualities of he had the qualities Irishmen look for in a leader. When he died a hero's death, the United Irishmen were suffused for a brief moment with romantic glow. At the end of March, the government proclaimed martial law in most of Leinster, and the shades of Cohen and livery billeted soldiers on the people without payment while they searched for arms. They despoiled the peasantry of their food and goods and abandoned all restraint in their attempts to rout out the local leadership, the colonels, captains, and sergeants of the United Irish, adding to the native cruelties of half hanging, pitch capping, and house burning, the common military torture, learning from British and Continental armies of excessive flogging. Learned from British and Continental armies of excessive flogging. Men were stripped to the waist, tied to a wooden triangle, and flogged with a cat of nine tails until they named a United Irishman. He would be fetched, and the same procedure gone through again. No one was safe. Whole villages were terrorized, the innocent being tied to the triangles alongside the guilty. The country people would kneel in the streets weeping their hats off while the floggings went on. The United Irishmen had to rise. They had waited for the French so long that their leaders had been arrested. If they wanted, if they waited any longer, their organization would break up. They fixed on the 22nd, they fixed on the 23rd of May as the day they would attack Dublin and paralyze the government. But for their members in the capital, it was already too late. They had no leaders left. The risings came instead in Kildare, Wicklow, County Carlow, Offaly, Laos, and yeah, Laos and Meath. United Irishmen turned to government troops, the militia, and especially Protestant loyalists. Prominent Catholic loyalists were generally left alone. Towns and villages were swept alternatively by government troops and rebels, the government forces being slightly more soldierly generally contriving to massacre rebels and mildly dissident peasants in their hundreds. The peasants were, for the most part, so terrified of the troops that they readily surrendered what arms they had. The most formidable outbreak was to come in the South. Wexford had always been a quiet country. Protestant houses were not raided for arms, and as they were elsewhere, and a number of regular troops and militia garrisoned there were small. But the government received information that Wexford was a probable landing point for the French invasion and sent the North Cork militia, who was supposed to have invented pitch capping, into the country to search for arms. Not exactly sure what pitch capping is, but this guy has a stick that looks like it's burning, and he's holding this other guy who's on his knees by his hair. So I don't know if they set their hair on fire or what. But anyway, we'll look that up at a later time. um, the people were given 14 days to surrender any arms they had, but the soldier could not wait to start their floggings and torture. The Catholic peasantry, in danger whatever they did, decided to make a fight of it. And about 14,000 of them, some carrying the green flag of the United Irish and others the white flag of the defenders, roamed through the town and countryside with no clear objective but to face government forces bravely whenever they came upon them. The Catholic curate, Father John Murphy, became their leader. Dreadful atrocities were committed. An unknown number of peasants or Protestants were slaughtered in a windmill on Vinegar Hill, a rebel stronghold outside Enniscorthy, Enniscorthy, and another 200 people, mostly Protestant, burned to death in a barn at a place called Scullaboke, um, Scullabogue. While rumors had been spreading throughout the countryside that Protestant Orangemen meant to murder all Catholics, and the severity of the government forces firmly on the Orange side had persuaded the populace that the rumors were all too true. When the rebels broke into the city of Wexford itself, about 100 Protestants were shot or killed by pike thrust on Wexford Bridge and thrown into the river Slaney below, Slaney. No one had been prepared for such events in Wexford. The major outbreak had been expected in the north where the United Irishmen had their origins, but they had been so damaged by General Lake's campaign in 1797 and the loss of their leaders in March 1798. Both Catholics and Protestants were so horrified by tales of massacre in the South, and Protestants so disenchanted with the French revolutionaries because of their hostile attitude towards Americans, that when Ulstermen fought at all, they did it along the old sectarian lines. Such attempts as there was at subordinate rebellion soon fizzled out. Hold on, give me a second. They got a reference to what they felt about Americans. Number 5 for page 205. Let me see something. Number 5, chapter 9, number 5. It just says the French dictatorship had demanded money, a great deal of money, from the Americans in return for not molesting American shipping. So that was the reference there. Okay, fizzled out. There remained the mopping up. The government forces, ill-trained and poorly led, behaved with careless cruelty. When they retook Enniscorthy, which had fallen for a while to the Wexford rebels, they cheerfully set fire to a makeshift rebel hospital with the patients still inside. In the town of Antrim, which the Northern United Irishmen attacked, the dead and wounded were left in the streets for 2 days before a garrison cleared. before a garrison, cleared them away in carts and burned them, dead and alive together. Elsewhere, the militia um, shot and hanged people indiscriminately without trial or questions asked, neither knowing nor caring who was a rebel and who was not. Houses were set on fire almost as a matter of course. One soldier alone fired 14 in the morning. In some areas, every house was burned, though the rains of winter would soon be coming on. People were desperate for a way out of the dreaded situation. General Lake offered what he called the deluded masses a chance to surrender, provided they brought in their arms and betrayed their leaders. Otherwise, he said, he would destroy every town, cottage, and farmhouse, fought, found empty and slaughtered without trial every person having arms. What year is this? This is the 1700s. Okay, that's in the 18. Okay. It looks like they followed this same path. Um, I'm taking a small break here, you guys, but it seems like they followed this same path um, in the 1800s here, because I was remembering about the Immortal 300 when the enlistee soldiers turned on their superior soldiers in our so-called Civil War. Just taking a break for a quick minute, you guys. This is a long chapter. I do appreciate whomever showed up, and of course, whomever shows up later on to continue this reading. I mean, I'm doing pretty good. We in chapter 9, so we really more than halfway through the book. Oh, yeah, my throat is itching a little bit. Yeah, we're more than halfway through the book, so that's cool. Let's see. Empty slot, every person having arms. Okay. Pitt in England sent out the Marquis Cornwallis to be both Lord Lieutenant and Commander in Chief. Cornwallis was the only British general to have emerged from the American War of Independence with his reputation not merely unscathed, but enhanced. He overrode Lake. Troops were certainly not to be let loose on the countryside, and there was to be no punishment without trial. On the one hand, fugitive rebels were streaming into camps in Kildare and the Wicklow Mountains. They had to fight on or be hanged. And on the other side of Castle, the Irish establishment was the Irish establishment was talking glibly of exterminating all Catholics. Cornwallis took the sensible and liberal course of granting a general amnesty and forced the necessary bill through Parliament, so that on the 17th of July, 1798, the country had the respite it needed. About 50,000 people had been killed in a little more than a year, most of them in cold blood, but the rebellion was over. Then the French came. Uh-oh. Then the French came. Wolfe Tone had not seen the calamities that had overtaken the United Irishmen, nor the distress of the mass of the people. He had refused to believe that the Irish were not united at all, and the great revolt against Britain had degenerated into bloody sectarian warfare, but persistently assured the French, with his usual attractive optimism, that the Irish would rise as one man when the French liberators reached their shores. So the French prepared three invasions. I'm sorry. So the French prepared three invasion fleets, each carrying troops, arms, and ammunition to the beleaguered Irish. Some light ships were to sail from Channel ports, heavier vessels from Rochefort Rockfort, Rochefort, on the Atlantic coast, and the largest fleet with 3,000 troops from Brest. On the 22nd of August, three warships flying the British flag sailed into Killala Bay, Killala, Killala Bay in County Mayo. A British Army officer was fishing in the bay cell. Hold on, you guys. A British Army officer who was fishing in a bay sailed across to offer them some of his catch. When he arrived on board, he was taken prisoner, for the ships, though flying a British flag, were from Rockfort and had 1,000 French troops aboard. When the Protestant Bishop of Killala was entertaining guests that evening, he was interrupted by a terrified messenger who told him there were French soldiers outside the town. The local yeomanry made a brief stand against them in the streets, but in no time the French leader, General Humbert, was in the bishop's house. Humbert, Humbert. The next day, Humbert hoisted the green flag bearing the words Iran Gobrak, or Ireland forever, and called upon Irishmen to rise and be free. But Connaught had taken no part in the rebellion, and the people there, though hardly loyal to Britain, did not aspire to independence. The peasants greeted the French um, I'm sorry, rapturously enough, and were only too pleased to be given handsome blue uniforms, muskets, and shot, but had no wish to be turned into soldiers. Many disappeared with their uniforms and muskets, sold them for whiskey, and then came back for more. Humbert moved south and within a week had routed Lake's much larger force in the engagement remembered as the Races of Castle Bar, just like it sounds. That is, races to get away from the French at the first cannon shot. Then Humbert set up a nominal Irish republic with the young local Catholic Irish gentleman as president and headed for County Leitrim, where he had news of a rising. Cornwallis was approaching with 20,000 men, and the French desperately needed Irish help. But when the Irish saw how few the Frenchmen were, they went home. They would not risk the vengeance of the Loyalist army after the French defeat, and a few days later, Humbert had to surrender. He and his men were taken to Dublin, galley singing the Marseillaise, and then, after a banquet in honor of their officers, shipped home to France. The second French expedition consisted of one fast ship with a cargo of arms and 280 men aboard, under the command of one of the original United Irishmen in Dublin, James Napper Tandy, Tandy. The ship had left Dunkirk on the 4th of September, 4 days before Humbert's surrender, and anchored in the harbor of Rutland on the northwest tip of County Donegal on the 16th of September. The French took over the post office and distributed leaflets calling upon Irishmen to rise until the postmaster, who turned out to be an old friend of Napper Tandy's, told them of the failure of the rebellion and Humbert's surrender. Tandy was appalled. In Paris, he had been saying that 30,000 Irishmen would rebel at his nod. He had supper with an old friend, drank himself into a stupor, and had to be carried back to his ship, which sailed for France the next morning. The third and last of the French expeditions was the largest, with 10 ships and 2,800 men on board. Wolfe Tone was in the flagship, appropriately called Hawk. The fleet sailed from Brest into the Atlantic and round to the northern coast of Donegal, where early in the morning on the 12th of October, after 23 days sailing, it was sighted by a British naval squadron far more heavily equipped than the French ship with guns. The French urged Tone to escape in a faster schooner they had with them, but naturally he refused and commanded a battery in the ensuing battle, and the first he had ever been in. Hawk had lost her topmast in rough weather. and surrendered after 4 hours fighting, while the other French ships sailed for France. 6 of them were captured later. Tone made no attempt to hide his identity from the British and was, of course, made a prisoner. Though he wore a uniform of a French general, for the um, he was put in irons for the journey to Dublin. He was charged with treason, and as the outcome of the trial was inevitable, he did not put up a defense, simply saying he had done his duty and no doubt the courts would do theirs. Quote, from my earliest youth, he told the courts, I have regarded the connection between Ireland and Britain as the curse of the Irish nation and felt convinced that while it lasted, this country could never be free nor happy. End quote. All he asked was to be shot out of respect for the uniform he wore instead of being hanged. Nevertheless, after his trial ended, he had to listen to the galleys being erected outside his window. He was to be executed on the Monday, and on Sunday evening, he was told that his request for a soldier's death had been refused. When his gaoler, might be jailer, but it's Gaoler, came to wake him about 4 o'clock in the next morning, he found him with his throat cut, yet still alive. He had tried to kill himself with a penknife and hacked through his windpipe. Some loyalists thought he should have his wounds sewed up and then hanged, but his friends raised a valid query about the legality of his trial. He had come before the court. He had come before a court martial, though he was not a member of any of the Irish armed forces, and Ireland was not under martial law. He lingered for a week in agony and then heard a surgeon say that if he were to move or speak, it would be fatal for him. Quote, I can yet find word to thank you, sir, he said to have whispered. It is more welcome news. Um, it is the most welcome news you could give me, end quote. And he died immediately. He was 35. Wolfe Tone was brave, honorable, highly intelligent, and very likable, but he was not realistic. He had a lighthearted optimism with which he misled the French allies, his followers, and even himself. If things had turned out as he thought they would, if the large French force had landed sooner, if the Irish had raised in support of the French, but Tone, fired with enthusiasm, mistook the facts. He made the disastrous error of encouraging the Irish to rebel unsuccessfully, and the result for Ireland was not the separation from Britain he craved, but union. And this chapter is called Union. Okay. Welcome to the room. When the rebellion was no more than a fortnight old, William Pitt, the British Prime Minister, had decided the only way of dealing with Ireland was to bring her into the dissoluble union with Britain. The dangers of the situation, if neglected, were appalling. Britain was fighting for her life against a most powerful enemy. To have a descendant Ireland on her flank, likely to welcome French invaders, was more than the larger country could cope with. Nowadays, when the population in Britain is 50 million and that of the whole of Ireland not more than 5 million, we do not always understand why Ireland was such a problem to Britain. But during the French Revolutionary Wars, the relative population of Britain and Ireland were quite different. Ireland had a large population, as she has now, but the population of Britain was only 11 million, little more than double that of Ireland. Britain had to have Ireland on her side. Then there was the chronic state of disorder, the dreadful discontent of Ireland. The Irish government, in Pitt's view, had failed, and so had bu- that loyal, eloquent, but corrupt body, the Irish Parliament. Government from Westminster might be more effective, leading to the redress of grievances, a weakening of the Protestant ascendancy, and full Catholic emancipation. In the early days of the century, the English and Ireland had suggested a union, and Britain had turned them down. Much later, Britain had made tentative approaches to Ireland and likewise had been turned down. Up to the time of the rebellion, none among the Protestant nation, and certainly no Catholics or Presbyterians, wanted to risk the individuality and cohesiveness of Ireland, which, in spite of its deepest divisions, was emerging. Union with Britain could turn Ireland into a backwater, her energy drained off to another country, and her political leaders no more than the minority in the foreign parliament, where her problems would be forgotten. But after the rebellion, people were afraid. No one in Ireland had been able to look after himself, and when Pitt's men put the case for union, they were they were listened to. The Protestant did not want to lose their privileges, but on the other hand, the Union could prevent them from being swamped eventually by emancipated Catholics. The Catholics, too, began to see advantages in union. The nationalism of the peasants remained dormant. They did not seem to care who ruled them, the English, the French, or anyone else, so long as their grievances were attended to. But the Catholic Church in Ireland and some small Catholic upper class realized that the union could be means of breaking the Protestant monopoly of power. Other groups had very real fears of union. The merchants and traders who had benefited so greatly under Grattan's parliament hesitated to trust the British government. They remembered only too well how British jealousy had hampered the wool trade, the glass industry, brewing, the export of livestock, and all attempts to develop Irish shipping. On the other hand, union might enable them to join freely in the commerce of the British Empire. Lawyers saw union as bringing the separate Irish judiciary to an end, just as the case of Sherlock versus Annesley, sorry about that, Annesley, the English House of Lords had taken over from the Irish Lords as a Supreme Court for England. The Presbyterians, represented by the Orange Order, made it clear that in any clash between their interests and the Union, they would put their interests first. And Dublin, one of the liveliest capitals in Europe, when the government left and parliament shut down, the aristocracy and gentry would give up their townhouses, dismiss their servants, abandon their coach builders, tailors, stonemasons, and plasterers who depended on their custom and move away. Dublin would dwindle into a dull provincial city. When Cornwallis took over in June 1798, he brought with him as his chief secretary Lord Castlereagh, later to become the famous British Foreign Secretary. When the amnesty had been declared and the worst of the crisis was over, they began to negotiations. Catholics were told rather vaguely that union would bring them state funding for their clergy, an end to the payment of tithes to Protestant clergy, and full emancipation, that is, seats in Parliament. The Catholic bishops met at Maynooth in January 1799, accepted the offer of state provision, and agreed in return that the government should be able to verify the loyalty of Irish bishops and clergy. The Protestant ascendancy unashamedly put itself up for sale. Leading Protestants traded their power and privileges for money, places, and improved peerages as if they were dealing in cattle and a cattle market. Political power was regarded as property, and pocket bureaus valued at £15,000 each. 1,260 pounds was paid out of their owners and charged to the Irish Exchequer. 16 borough owners were given English peerages. 28 new Irish peerages were created and 20 Irish peers were promoted. Yet Parliament fought tooth and nail against the Union and would destroy it. Protestant magnates sold their pocket boroughs and, their pocket boroughs, but not their votes. When union was first mooted in Parliament in January 1799, it was furiously debated twice, the opposition losing the first debate by a single vote and winning the second by 111 votes to 106. Castlereagh, which is Castle, Castlereagh, okay. Castlereagh had to promise not to bring up the subject of union again so long as it appeared repugnant to the sense of the Parliament and the country. But Pitt was determined. He refused to allow the general election or the union or the issue of union, and let it be known that it would be reintroduced in session after session of Parliament until it was accepted. Castlereagh set himself to buy votes as well as boroughs. Office holders who would not toe the government line were dismissed, and it was made generally known that no one had any chance of government office in the future unless he supported union. Opponents of union were bribed to stay away from Parliament, and others, strangely enough, gave up their seats to supporters of unions rather than vote for it themselves. The opposition, as well as the government, bought votes. One member of Parliament sold his vote to the government and then accepted another £4,000 from the opposition to vote for them. Cornwallis, who was less detached than Castlereagh, hated himself for engaging in such dirty work. Quote, "How long oh, I'm sorry, how I long," he wrote, "to kick those whom my public duty obliges me to court." End quote. When Parliament, okay, when Parliament met again on the 15th of January 1800, members debated the Union with extreme heat all night and into the next morning. About 7 a.m., Grattan entered the House of Commons. Since his withdrawal from Parliament 3 years earlier, he had been ill and listless. Then, on the very day Parliament met, his friends brought him bought him a seat in Wicklow and rushed his election through. He appeared in the House wearing his old volunteer uniform, hardly able to walk, but supported by a friend on each side of him, with his head hanging and his face deathly pale. At his first, I'm sorry, give me a second, you guys. Let me um let me regroup here. Struggling over words for a quick second. Okay, we're on page 212. Now we getting through this chapter pretty fast right here. Yeah, we're getting through this one pretty fast. All right. Okay. At first, his voice could hardly be heard, but as he went on, the old fire came back to him. After 2 hours, he upheld the right of Ireland to dignity, sovereignty, and his own legislature, in the word, to liberty, and denounced the Union. To no avail, Castlereagh had done his work too well, and at 10 o'clock that morning, the Union was carried by 138 votes to 96. For some months, the opposition fought on, organizing petitions and trying to arouse public opinion, but the people had deserted them. There were 50,000 British troops in the country, and Ireland was cowed. By the 28th of March, the terms of union had been accepted by both houses. The Bill of Union was drawn up, and despite the passionate eloquence of the opposition, passed its first and second readings. Before the debate on the third reading was over, the bulk of the opposition left the House of Commons in a body. They could not bear to wait for the miserable end. The Irish Parliament was corrupt and ineffectual. It had never represented much more than the English interest in Ireland, and during its last years, it was a tool of the Protestant ascendancy. If Grattan had succeeded in bringing the Catholics, it might have lasted longer. Yet for 500 years, it had been the legislative body of Ireland, a focus for Irish political life and the counterpose to the rule of Justiciars, Lord Lieutenants, and Viceroys from England. When Parliament had been dissolved for the last time, the fine 18th century Parliament House was sold to the Bank of Ireland with a secret stipulation that the chambers were the two houses, wait, that the chambers where the two houses had met should be altered until they were unrecognizable to lay all ghosts. The common chamber became the banking hall. Hold on, you guys. Okay. Um, the Commons chamber became the banking hall, but the Lords, by some oversight, has remained unchanged to this day, a monument to the Protestant ascendancy with tapestries commemorating William's victory at the Boyne and the siege of Londonderry. The Union had largely touched the people of Britain. I'm sorry. The Union had hardly touched the people of Britain. They were more concerned about the war with France. Pitt gave a masterly dissertation on the value of the Union to a lackadaisical House of Commons and was met with but one dissentient voice. It belonged to Richard Brinsley Sheridan, remembered nowadays mainly as a playwright, who said the English were more ignorant of the affairs of Ireland than any other country in the world. He was an Irishman, he knew. He was an Irishman, he knew. In the upper house, the poet Lord Byron said it was the union of a shark with its prey, but no one was very interested. And on the 1st of August, 1800, the Act of Union received the royal assent. Mhm. In September, Castlereagh outlined the terms of the Union, which was to come into force on the 1st of January, 1801. Ireland was to have 100 seats in the British House of Commons, 28 peers and 4 bishops in the Lords. The Church of Ireland was to be amalgamated with the Church of England. Ireland was still to have a viceroy, and the English laws and judiciary, contrary to the lawyers' fears, were to remain unchanged. Trade was to be free between Ireland and Britain. Ireland was to share British privileges in trade with the empire, and the bounty of Irish linen was to remain. As far as the taxation went, Ireland was to contribute to the expenses of the new United Kingdom in the proportion of 2 to 15 for 20 years, ratio of 2 to 15 for 20 years, and then the ratio was to be reviewed. During that time, Ireland would have its own exchequer and her own national debt. So far, so good. The terms were generous, but Irish members of parliament were to take an oath of allegiance which would exclude Catholics, although Irish Catholics would retain the right to vote granted them in the Catholic Relief Act of 1793. Pitt had intended to make the Catholic emancipation part of the Treaty of Union. He was well aware that differences in the treatment of the Catholics and Protestants were a great part of the trouble in Ireland, but he had so much opposition from Protestants that he had abandoned all thought of Catholic emancipation for the time being, simply to push the Union through. Yet the vague promises of Ireland's Catholics had been made in good faith. Pitt had every intention of introducing a Catholic emancipation bill as soon as the Union was in being. And early in 1801, he proposed to George II that Catholics should be admitted to Parliament and state provisions made for the Catholic clergy. But Farmer George, I'm sorry, but Farmer George, never the brightest of British kings, his name is Farmer? Okay. But Farmer George, never the brightest of British kings, was convinced that the royal assent to a Catholic emancipation bill would constitute a breach of his coronation oath to uphold the Protestant church. George was elderly and none too well. We know now that he suffered from a physical disease of porphyria, which induces delirium, but his contemporaries, including Pitt, thought his mind was disordered. Pitt could have pressed George harder. He may have persuaded Parliament to amend the coronation oath, but he was so afraid that any argument or contradiction would push the king over the brink into madness, leaving Britain in the midst of a terrible war to tender mercies of the frivolous spendthrift Prince of Wales that had promised never to raise the question of Catholic emancipation again so long as the king should live. Pitt was cold and austere, but not unprincipled. He could only drop Catholic emancipation if he resigned, and resign he did, followed by Cornwallis and Castlereagh. The Irish Catholics were flabbergasted. They felt they had been duped. No significant promises had been made to them, but they had most certainly been led to understand that emancipation would follow union, and their support had been secured on the understanding. And now the author of the union, the man behind the understanding, had quit and would not even fight for them. It's funny because this right here, I think this has to do with what I'll say sometimes about the Scots denationalized the Irish, but we see it in another context right here. Okay, but it says the union had been generally intended to benefit Ireland as well as Britain, but nothing in the Irish situation changed. Religious differences still rang like a gaping wound through the country. Irish peasants were still the poorest in Europe, and the same waves of crime and disorder swept through the countryside as half a century earlier. During the next 20 years, the government passed frequent coercion laws. Martial law was almost permanent, and habeas corpus was suspended as often as not. The British garrison of 25,000 men kept in Ireland in case of a French invasion was used to keep order. From the Middle Ages until the 17th century, the Irish government of Ireland had been a military one. I'm sorry. From the Middle Ages until the 17th century, the English government of Ireland had been a military one. And at the beginning of the 19th century, military government seemed to be back. In 1803, there was a flicker of rebellion. For a moment, the United Irishmen lived again. The young Protestant student, Robert Emmet, whose younger brother had been among the leaders of the United Irishmen in 1798, met an American armament specialist in Paris and became so enthusiastic about a kind of primitive landmine, a wooden box filled with explosives and shrapnel. Um, the American showed him that on his return to Dublin in 1802, he made plans for a rising using a landmine for the following summer. For months, United Irishmen made arms in various hideouts in Dublin to be used in attacks on the castle and other key points. In July of 1803, a proclamation headed the provisional government of the people of Ireland was rushed off the presses and distributed, while Emmet, in the green uniform with gold epaulets of the United Irish General, waited for his supporters. He expected 2,000 of them, but only 80 turned up, and the organization which was to support them proved haphazard to say the least. The fuses for hand grenades were lost. The man who was to have made fuses for the landmines had forgotten to do it. The scaling ladders for the attack on Dublin Castle were not ready, and the horses pulling the coaches, which were to take the rebels to the castle, had mysteriously bolted. Without much help, Emmett drew his sword and led his handful of followers out among the Saturday evening crowds. Arms were handed out, and before long, an uncontrollable mob, waving pikes and blunderbusses, were rampaging through the streets. It followed, it found itself surrounding a coach carrying the Lord Chief Justice, not an unpopular man, and piked him to death. Emmett was appalled when he heard of it later that night. His own band of followers dwindled until there were only about 20 left, and to avoid more bloodshed, he called the whole thing off. But the mob went on rioting all night. Emmett was caught about a month later, tried and condemned to be hanged. He spoke from a dock with such feeling about Irish liberty that many of his friends who were there, or even the judge, were deeply moved. Then he asked to be buried in an unmarked grave, concluding, quote, "When my country takes her place among the nations of the earth, then and not until then let my epitaph be written," end quote. The later years, in later years, he became a folk hero to the people of Ireland, a figure of romantic youthful protest like the Czech student martyr John Polak, Palach, in our own day. Following the footsteps of Wolfe Tone, he became part of the myth that was in eventually to free Ireland. After Emmet's execution, Ireland went politically dead. Dublin stagnated. The viceroy had moved to the suburb Phoenix Park. There was no season anymore. Noblemen sold their townhouses and trade declined. The French wars imposed a heavy burden. The requirement that Ireland should pay uh, 2 to 15 of a ratio of 2 to 15 of the cost has seemed reasonable enough, but in practice it meant that during the next 15 years Irish government expenditure tripled, whereas the British expenditure only increased by 50%. Irish taxes were increased by 52% after the Union, but the exchequer still had to borrow, and the loans had to be serviced. By 1817, the Irish national debt had gone up by a staggering 250%. Then the British and Irish exchequers were amalgamated so that Britain could take over some of Ireland's debt. Protestants remained in the ascendant and became ardent supporters of the Union when they saw it for what it was, a strengthening of the British connection. The Presbyterians found the market for linen improved and they too became avid unionists. The Rigum, the Regium Donum was greatly increased and paid, not as a single lump sum, but to individual Presbyterian ministers as a reward for their loyalty. But the Catholics, the great masses of people, remained sadly disappointed. Their churches and chapels had been repaired at government expense after the rebellion of 1798, but beyond that, there was no help. Catholics still maintained their priests themselves as well as paying the hated tithes to the Protestant clergy. The government and the law remained alien to them. The Protestant members of Parliament sitting over the waters at Westminster were totally remote. Yet Catholics were not forgotten. Granton waited sadly until 1805, then obtained an English seat, Malton or Malton, which is Malton, in Yorkshire, in the House of Commons, and took up the case of Catholic emancipation once more. Pitt died in 1806, wore out at an early age of 48. George III remained inflexible. Remained inflexibly opposed to emancipation, and the Prince of Wales, who became regent in 1811, maintained the same position. Most Britons did not see what Irish Catholics had to complain of. British Catholics still had no votes and were excluded from all government service except at the lowest levels. Britons did not realize that whereas in Britain Catholics were, were a small minority, in Ireland they were the bulk of the population. Granton's approach was conciliatory. In his various proposals, he included a government right to veto the appointment of any Catholic bishop whose loyalty was questionable. A term of Catholic bishops was accepted at Maynooth in 1799. But Catholic opinion in Ireland was hardening. The old aristocratic Catholic leadership, with its mealy-mouthed addresses of loyalty, was being thrust aside by the far more vigorous and radical lawyers and merchants of the middle class, who denounced the veto as a betrayal of Irish interest. Prominent among those middle class Catholics was Daniel O'Connell, a bold, down to earth, and extremely dexterous lawyer who was to take over Grattan's mantle as a supreme Irish patriot, becoming the champion, or became, oh, I'm sorry, patriot, become the champion of the Catholics, especially the poor, and earn the title of liberator of the nation. The O'Connells were Old Irish, a well to do land-owning family in Kerry, Kerry, which had kept its Catholic religion and contrived to increase its estates during the penal period with the help of a Protestant kinsman. Like other such families, they had developed ties with Catholic countries abroad. One of Daniel's uncles became the general in a French army, or in the French army, and another was the chaplain at the Austrian court for 60 years. A third uncle, Old Hunting Cap, remained behind in Kerry and maintained the family fortune by smuggling. Privateers loaded with French silks and wines anchored regularly off of, what is this city? Caherchevin, Caherchevin, or Caherchevin. Okay, Chirciveen. Okay, so he anchored off of that place. On the O'Connell, this is on the O'Connell stretch of the Wild Kerry coast. Daniel himself was fostered, following the old custom with the herdsmen, and then sent to France to be educated. From there, he went to London to study law, and in May 1798 was called to the Irish bar. He could not have come to Dublin at a more devastating time. The rebellion went off like so many firecrackers all around him, and he was appalled by it. In London, he had picked up liberal, even radical views. He shared Wolfe ideal of a united Ireland with people of every religion playing their part, and he admired the independence of Grattan's parliament. But when he saw the horror of armed rebellion and the cruelty of its suppression, he decided the first tenet of his political creed must be loyalty. Rebellion was not only horrific, it was impracticable. It did not work. And he himself would always operate on the right side of treason. For several hours, he built up his practice. I'm sorry, for several years, he built up his practice at the bar. Since the Union, the courts had replaced Parliament with a scene of oratory and debate. And O'Connell, prodigiously energetic, wittingly skillful, and even unscrupulous, was soon well known. His fame brought him the opportunity to lead the Catholic rebels in their continuing campaign for emancipation, which for many years he did quietly enough, merely forwarding petitions to the Westminster Parliament, where Grattan was gradually educating the opinion of British MPs. In 1819, Grattan introduced the Catholic Emancipation Bill into the British House of Commons for the third time. The earlier bills had been defeated fairly substantially, but the bill was only lost by 2 votes. In 1820, Grattan died, and in the following year, his successors put up 2 more bills, which were passed in the Commons and defeated in the Lords. In Ireland, people were bitterly disappointed, and O'Connell decided the time had come for the Catholic movement to be more aggressive. In May 1823, he formed a new Catholic association, which would put members into Parliament who, though necessarily Protestant, would fight for Catholic emancipation. At first, the association seemed just another middle class political group and aroused little interest. But then in 1824, O'Connell broadened the membership. Those who could not afford the annual membership fee of 1 guinea were invited to join an associate member for 1 shilling a year or a penny a month, and the situation was transformed. The parish priests, who were automatically members, enrolled their parishioners and, week after week, collected their subscriptions. The penny a month soon became known as the Catholic rent and brought in about £1,000 a week from 250,000 poor Catholic families. For the first time, the Catholic peasantry was being organized for political ends. The early 19th century was not a democratic age, and neither Britain nor Ireland were the common people permitted to speak for themselves. A tenant's voice was part of his landlord's property. When the Catholic Association began organizing the peasantry into a disciplined body with the funds and their leadership to get what they wanted, the government was extremely alarmed. It seemed as if the white boys, the defenders, and other secret societies were banding together, as if the forces of the violence which had within living memory broken into rebellion with such appalling ferocity were about to break out again. In March 1825, the Catholic Association was banned. O'Connor, who had boasted earlier that he could drive a coach and four through any legal restriction placed on it, set the association up for months set the association up again 4 months later with the innocuous aims of persuading public and private charity, promoting public peace and tranquility, as well as private harmony between all classes and all purposes not prohibited by law. But the fact that the Catholic Association was palpably not treasonable and could not be dealt with as if it were, left the government helpless. The Catholic Relief Act of 1793 had given the vote to all Catholics who were 40 shilling freeholders. That had met the theory that everyone except the very poorest could express his political will for almost a piece of property, for almost any piece of property. Even a couple of chairs could count as 40 shilling freehold. But there was no secret ballot, and in practice, tenants voted as their lords directed them to. It was a disgrace to our Constitution and our country, Wolfe had said, to see that wretched tribe of 40 shilling freeholders driven to their octennial market by their landlords. Since the landlords. Since the formation of the Catholic Association, however, priests had occasionally prevailed on their parishioners to define their lords at the polls. We are on page 219, chapter 9. Let me see this reference. Number 9. Is that number 9 or number 7? 7. Okay. General elections were held every 8 years. Number 6 is a freeholder did not, as today, own freehold property, but a heritable tenancy which his heirs could claim after his death. Okay. All right. Where are we here? 219. Okay. In 1826, when the general election was to be held, O'Connell still thought the peasants would be led to the polls by their landlords like so many sheep. But in Westmeath, County Dublin, Roscommon, and Monaghan, the priests, not the landlords, directed the people how to vote and gave their support to emancipationist candidates. In Louth, the emancipationists defeated a candidate whose family had controlled the county for half of a century, and in County Waterford, where Lord George Beresford, a member of the most powerful landed family in Ireland, had sat for 20 years, an emancipationist was put up too. 10 days before the polling, O'Connell swung the weight of the Catholic Association behind him. Members paraded through their own town in mass, wearing the green as a symbol of nationhood, and green handkerchiefs, green sashes, green ribbons, and green cockades. The association patrolled the town and maintained perfect order. Elections were usually the occasion of drunkenness and rioting, but this time drunks were ducked in the rivers, and there was no riotous behavior whatsoever. Lord George castigated his opponent for his ungentlemanly behavior and withdrew his candidature. The Catholic Association had put his man in. In March 1828, the Duke of Wellington became Prime Minister, and Sir Robert Peel Mm, same way you spell Kevin and Peel. Okay, never mind. The leading opponent of Catholic claims, Home Secretary. The Catholic Association immediately resolved to oppose all government candidates, whether they were emancipationists or not, and held some 20,000 protest meetings simultaneously in parishes all over Ireland, a brilliant piece of organization by the priest. Then in June, William Vesey Fitzgerald, oops, oops, where'd it go? Then in June, William Vesey Fitzgerald, one of two members for Clare, had to fight. Okay, my bad. Had to fight a by-election for his seat and had become president of the Board of Trade. And the rule was that any member appointed to the government had to go back to his constituency for re-election. And that's reference number 8. I'm gonna read that real quick. Um, it says under the succession to the Crown Act of 1707, this extraordinary rule, which could delay the formation of an administration by many months, was not modified until the Re-election of Ministers Act was passed in 1919. Okay, so that's the reference that they they referenced there. Where was I at? Shit, priest. Next step, challenged. Okay, somewhere in here. But he support. Okay, let me go back to this sentence and come forward. Then in June, William Vesey Fitzgerald, one of two members for Clare, had to fight a by-election for his seat. He had become president of the Board of Trade, and the rule was that any member appointed to the government had to go back to his constituency for re-election. Vesey Fitzgerald was an emancipationist, a kind and popular landlord, an experienced politician, and the son of a patriot in Granton's parliament. But he supported the wrong government, and O'Connor himself decided to stand against him. There was nothing in the law to prevent a Catholic from being elected to parliament, and it was so obvious the next step for the Catholic Association was to put a Catholic candidate up. When, as was inevitable, the new Catholic member refused to take the oath of allegiance and supremacy in the House of Commons, the government would be seriously challenged, and might of the million or so 40-shilling freeholders would have to be taken into account. O'Connell stood as a man of the people. Nothing could have been better calculated to frighten the government. In the general opinion, only the gentry and those above them were fitted to select governments because they owned property, real property, not poultry 40-shilling freeholds. And the desire to safeguard their property rendered them stable, responsible, and unlikely to rock the boat. O'Connell was quite well off. He had inherited an estate in Kerry and earned a high income at the bar. But as a man of the people, uncrowned king of the 40-shilling freeholders, he seemed to be what the government most dreaded, a demagogue, a rabble-rouser, the leader of a popular revolution. When the election came, the atmosphere was tense with excitement, alive with optimism. Once again, officials of the Catholic Association made sure that the crowds of 40-shilling freeholders, decked in the green, behaved impeccably, marching to the polls in long, orderly columns. They were divided into squads like soldiers, but to show there was nothing warlike about them, each squad was led by an official known as a pacificator. The government was far more frightened of Pacific, okay, than fighting Irishmen. Okay. It could not send its troops against them. Only O'Connell was victorious, winning the seat by 2,057 votes to 982. The government found the extent of his support unnerving. They dared not refuse the Irish masses what they had voted for. And early in 1828, a Catholic Emancipation Act was passed, which enabled Catholics to be judges, admirals, and generals, as well as members of Parliament. The only positions still withheld from them being those of Lord Lieutenant or Viceroy, Lord Chancellor in either England or London, and Regent. At the same time, the government made sure the Irish peasantry would never again be able to force its hand into putting a second act through Parliament, which raised the minimum freehold for the franchise to £10, immediately reducing the Irish Catholic electorate from 1,160,000 to 86,000. Whereupon the Catholic Association, having achieved its object, disbanded itself. O'Connor, okay. O'Connor arrived in Westminster to take his seat after the Catholic Emancipation Act had received the loyal assent, but the government had meanly refused to make the act retrospective, so that he had to go all the way back to Clare to be reelected. When he reached Ennis, the county town, he was met by 40,000 people and after a triumphal entry, re-elected unopposed. As soon as they had taken his seat in the House of Commons, O'Connell began campaigning for the repeal of the Union. At first, he had no success whatsoever. No British MPs had any interest in the subject, and only 39 Irish members were in favor of repeal. But the arguments put forward on both sides when he first moved the repeal of union to remain in force for the rest of the country. Hold on, let me read that again. But the arguments put forward on both sides when he first moved the repeal of the union were to remain in force for the rest of the century. Okay, that's what it was. O'Connor wanted Ireland's position to be the same as it had been during the Grattan's Parliament, when Ireland had been a sister kingdom to Britain, loyal to the same monarch, but with her own independent legislature. This time, though the Irish Parliament was to be reformed and truly representative of the predominantly Catholic Irish people, the government contended that Ireland and Britain were already equal. Irishmen and Britons um, having equal rights in each other's countries, and claimed quite correctly that industry in the north had developed so greatly since the Union that the population of Belfast had tripled. But British ignorance of the problems of the agricultural South and West remained total. O'Connell struggled on, fighting one coercion act after another and supporting the Tithe Act passed in 1838, which incorporated the tithe into the rent and made the landlord, not the parson or the tithe proctor, responsible for its collection, rendering the injustice of the system less apparent. Then, in 1841, the Liberals with whom O'Connell had aligned himself were swept from office, and he took his campaign for repeal out of Parliament. An ineffectual repeal association already founded in Dublin was remodeled on the lines of the Catholic Association, and the penny a month reintroduced as the repeal rent. For a whole, let me say something right here real quick. Something just came to mind. If you guys are familiar with Callie House, the story of the sister named Callie House, and she was one who was trying to vie for retirement funds, if you were, for ex-slaves here in America, and along, um, surprisingly, you find that along the Pan-African line or websites. You know, this is kind of like the same thing. Let's put a few pennies together so that we can, you know, um, create something, have financial support, yada yada. But she was, I think she was jailed, fined, or whatever with that, the mutual fund. campaign for Cali House. Y'all might want to look at that because it sounds just like this here. Not that they're the same thing, but they're along the same lines. Okay. But they ended up getting her for like mail fraud, dealing with the post office and stuff like that. So, and we're almost finished. We only got like 2 pages more to go. Okay. Um, where we at? Okay. Where was that? Okay. For a while, it could not get started. Then the Catholic bishops and priests declared for it and brought the peasantry and the Catholic middle classes with them, the Protestants remaining firmly Unionist. O'Connell began addressing weekly meetings of the Repeal Association, describing repeal vaguely and emotively as the pancreas of all ills. The Repeal Association lacked the broad power base among the peasants of the old Catholic Association, but it included among its members a group of talented and idealistic young men from the middle classes, both Catholic and Protestant, who in 1812 founded a newspaper, The Nation, which soon became the organ of the association. The Nation covered O'Connell's meetings, reported his speeches, and rapidly gained the readership of more than 250,000, far more than any other newspaper in the country. Anybody find it interesting that they call that the Nation? The Nation of Islam has one that they call, never mind, or along those same lines, never mind. Just a thought in my head right there. Might not be called the Nation. Anyway, in 1843, O'Connell carried his campaign further with a series of huge public demonstrations in open air, monster monster meetings, as they were called in the London Times, which habitually opposed him. Vast numbers turned up. 500,000 people packed the streets and even climbed on the rooftops of a mass meeting in the center of Cork, the city of Cork. Sound like some Bible shit right there. They lowered him down through the roof. Anyway, hundreds of thousands heard O'Connell speak at Roscrea in County Limerick, Roscrea, Roscrea, in County Limerick, at Donnybrook, outside Dublin, at Ennis, and at Wexford, and 750,000 converged in the hill on the hill of Tara. Okay, the hero of Tara. These huge crowds were just as well disciplined, orderly, and peaceful as the members of the Catholic Association had been. Nevertheless, they resembled an army, albeit an army without arms. They were organized into squads and columns, and at one meeting, a troop of horsemen appeared in cavalry formation. O'Connor, O'Connell maintained his belief in a pacific movement, meaning pacifying, but Pacific movement, and fostered in the huge crowds of warm, emotionally loyal to the young Queen Victoria. But his oratory did not lack warlike metaphors, which the Nation duly recorded. The monster meetings often began with an open air mass conducted from a low hill or promontory where O'Connor, the clergy, and the local Catholic gentry stood. Then O'Connell, the liberator, made his address. He was a tall, powerful man with an excellent voice. Quote, "You hear it a mile off," one of his listeners said, "as if it were coming through honey," end quote. And he was an extremely experienced agitator. He whipped up the crowds by asking if there was any man who would not die for Ireland, and immediately answered on their behalf that there was not a man amongst them, would not brunt the battle's blaze and the glory in achieving victory for Ireland. The Nation, the reporting of his meetings, used metaphors reminiscent of the United Irishmen and 1798. The government was alarmed. Although O'Connell had little following in the House of Commons, at home in Ireland he was the powerful head of a huge national movement. There had been some sympathy at Westminster for the cause of Catholic emancipation, which had been on the cards for 30 years before it was granted. But there was little support, even among the Irish members, for an end to the Union. Sir Robert Peel, the Prime Minister, even said the Civil War would be preferable to repeal, as that would lead to the dismemberment of the empire. The nation, the nation announced another monster meeting on the 5th of October, 1843 at Clontarf, Clontarf, the scene of Brian Boru's great victory, and in a leading article headed The Coming Struggle, described it hectically, hectically as a muster and march of the repeal volunteers and called for cavalry. The government took action. British troops were made ready, and on the 4th of October, only 24 hours before the meeting was to take place, the authorities banned it. O'Connell could have ignored the ban. Large or huge crowds could have assembled to hear him, and the troops might not have been able to contain them. He could have instructed the crowds to come armed and successfully resist the British contingent. But O'Connell was law abiding. He had always protested his absolute loyalty to the crown, and nonviolence was a part of his creed. It was a difficult thing to turn back 500,000 people, many of whom had already left home in a big, wild country with poor communications. But O'Connell did it. With the agreement and support of the journalists of the nation, he contrived to call the monster meeting off. Hold on. Okay. Okay. But the government was not content. 5 days later, O'Connell and 7 others, including Charles Gavin Duffy, the editor of The Nation, were arrested. O'Connell refused to travel to Dublin's Kilmainham jail in a hackney cab, but insisted on walking with his captor through the streets so everyone could see the liberator, the chosen leader of Ireland, had been picked up like a common housebreaker. With the others, he was charged with conspiring to alter the Constitution by force. He had, or he, who had run his associations openly, peacefully, and loyally, was being taunted with treason. The lengthy state trial of the four courts ended in February 1844 with a conviction from the Holy Protestant jury. O'Connell was granted bail for 3 months before sentence would be passed, and as a convicted traitor and bailee, went off to England to hold public meetings in Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and London. The huge dinner was held, I'm sorry, a huge dinner was held for him in the Opera House, Covent Garden, which had an auditorium and stage boarded right across for the occasion. Then a sentence of a year's imprisonment was passed. With his fellow prisoners, O'Connell was comfortably ensconced in the prison governor's and deputy governor's houses at Richmond Prison in Dublin. They had streams of visitors. Food was brought in from outside, and their dinner parties sometimes had 24 guests. But the injustice of the sentence, however easy its terms, sent a wave of sympathy through Ireland, and the repeal rent rose to more than 2,500 a week. Then, quite suddenly, in September, the House of Lords quashed the conviction on the ground that the prosecution had illegally manipulated the jury's list or the jury list. A triumphal a triumphal procession of 200,000 people were escorted. I'm sorry. A triumphal procession of 200,000 people escorted O'Connell to his Dublin home, while all over Ireland bands played, bonfires were lit, and houses were decked with laurel. In, I'm sorry, it was a hero's return. But the aging O'Connell had had his fingers burned. His campaign for repeal by peaceful means had failed. Shit, had failed, and the bluff of the Munster meeting had been called. He turned to federalism. Mm, mm, mm. He turned to federalism, the plea of moderate Irishmen for an Irish parliament for home affairs, with foreign and imperial matters directed from Westminster. A half measure seemed better than no measure, but the young men of the nation, young Ireland, as they had come to be called, were not to be deflected. In July 1846, the Repeal Association debated its future policy. Quote, I do not disclaim the use of arms as immoral, Thomas Meagher, a young Irelander from Waterford, declared, nor do I believe it is the truth to say the God of heavens withholds his sanction from the use of arms, be it for defense or be it for assertion of a nation's liberty. I look upon the sword as a sacred weapon, end quote. Then he used a metaphor which, though confused, made his feelings plain. Quote, if the sword has sometimes reddened the shroud of the oppressor, he said, it has at other times blossomed into flowers to deck the freeman's brow, end quote. A peaceful expression of the people's will had been spurred. Inevitable Irishmen would one day turn again to violence to achieve their legitimate ends. And family, that is the end of chapter 9 from the book A History of Ireland by Peter and Fiona Somerset Fry. Okay, I'm not going to go into much detail. It's almost 2 o'clock out here, but and we ended this on page 226, starting I think on 180 something or some shit like that. But anyway, the next chapter, chapter 10, would be the Great Famine. The thing that I look at here in this era, and I'm not well versed on history, I ain't gonna lie and say I am. Um, but I have often heard it said that Ireland's potato famine was directly related to America. So I'm still keeping those things in mind, even though the details of the stories um, bring other things, to bear on it, like what they were going through in Parliament and who did what and how they fought for political rights and this, that, and the other. But I'm keeping those things in mind. But on this next one, we're going to actually do 2 chapters because chapter 10 is very small. So our next reading, whenever that is, will be, hold on, I'm trying to get the chapter names here. I'm trying to find out. Okay, here we go. The next 2 chapters we're going to take as one. Thank you. Thank you. Um, chapter 10 is called The Great Famine. That's why I mentioned the potato part. And then the chapter after that is The Struggle for Home Rule. Now, I don't know how this is going to play out. But being that I have studied a little bit or read a little bit or heard or something as far as what the Moors said about Noble Drew Ali and New York or New Jersey, and then them moving over, Detroit was going to have to pay for what they did to the prophet, and then it moving into Chicago, going into Chicago, we hear this thing about home rule. So I'm going to kind of keep that in mind. I don't know if that newspaper is really called The Nation. It might be called something else, okay, as far as the Nation of Islam and Farrakhan and all that stuff. But I see some similarities still. And I don't know if this is correct or anything, but when they say the struggle for home rule, I know these people came over here. I know shit happened to bring it over here. I know this shit is parallel. But what I'm going to be looking at in these next 2 chapters, one is going to be that idea of home rule and Illinois and the Nation of Islam. Because I think it might be some other stuff there, because what be tripping me out is how Islam is supposed to be Muslim, but they always quoting the Christians as far as Farrakhan is concerned. So anyway, those are going to be the next two chapters, the Great Famine and the Struggle for Home Rule. And then it looks like we'll get into a rather good read beyond that called Blood Sacrifice. And then the looks like the Road to Freedom after that. But we're going to keep on reading. This is very interesting for me because, people be saying shit, but don't be saying shit. And again, we're almost, we're past the half, a little bit more, and we'll be three-quarters of the way into this book. So I do appreciate you guys for listening. My reading is getting better. It definitely is. And again, I thank you guys for your time and your interest in listening to this read, so we can put some things together. You know, find out why things might work and why things may not work as people move forward. See what's already been done. Yeah, that part. See things that have already been done, why they worked or why they didn't work, and even how we may have some misguided ideas about who's doing what for who. Like even in here, I find it really interesting that they talked about the men of orange or the orange men or whatever that is, and then you sit up and you call Trump, orange, okay? And William of Orange and all that other stuff. So hey, it's all tied up in here, okay? So family, I'm gonna go on and get off here, go take my butt to bed. Yeah, yeah, because we got issues over here. So family, I'm gonna go ahead and get off here. It wasn't too bad. We took about 2 hours to do that. And um, YouTube is doing some crazy stuff. So when I go out of this, more than likely you won't be able to see this until they release it back to the floor. So if you want to go back and read it, make sure that y'all keep this link that y'all were on, so that you can hear it again. But anyway, y'all, I'm tired. I'm going to bed. Appreciate your time, consideration, your patience, and all the like. Knowing that I can't do this on a daily basis, but I appreciate that you guys for attending to be able to hear this. All right. So family, we out of here. Okay. Good night. You guys have a great day. Have a great week. I'll see y'all around these YouTube streets.